Gabe Morales here, returning for another interesting episode on the NF prison gangs, regiments, and some key individuals, past and present, involved in spreading the NF to the streets. In that regard, I will cover the subjects who have been active with the Salinas Regiment over the years. In previous episodes, I already covered Fresno County as well as other counties outside of Monterey or Santa Clara County. As stated previously, if you look at this California Department of Justice map, as well as a map found on a Northern Structure member, you will see some areas that the NF has been active in over the years. Salinas is the largest city in Monterey County, so I'll start out with that city to be followed with other cities that fall underneath the Salinas Regiment.
On December 22nd, 1976, Mexican Mafia associate Alex Knuckles Moreno was killed by NF member Rafael Ernie Gabriel, who stabbed him 38 times for using dope that belonged to the NF and also for dealing with La M. Ernie's brother Greg, a.k.a. Manos, committed a murder in Salas in 1977. Another brother, Miguel, a.k.a. Cricket, was an NF shot caller at DVI in the late 1970s. I believe they also had a brother named Gary, and I know that they had ties to Washington State as well as Oklahoma City.
Coronado Spooky Duenas was an NF member who ran afoul of the organization in the mid-1970s and was deemed to be a priority hit. Jack Happy Rice was also a priority hit who was killed by the NF on July 18, 1976. The NF then killed his wife Gloria on December 31, 1976, as she had testified against the O. Paul Chino Chato Rice was also an NF in the 1970s, and his current status is unknown to me. Joe Leaky Bird Varela Hernandez was a key player in the NF in the early days and present when MA icon Chai Canena was killed at Chino's Palm Hall and was housed at Old Folsom Prison 4A in the early 1980s. I believe he was one of the few NF able to retire in good standing for his loyalty to the cause. Robert Babalu Rocha Prado was an NF in the early days until he dropped out in the late 1970s. Floyd Wayne Townsley Davis was an Anglo NF member in the 1970s who later DO'd.
Larry Cub Tapis was close to Copas Gallegos. Cub's sister Christina, a.k.a. La Brown Eyes, married NF member Joe Crow Calvos, who was a big drug dealer and who held NF meetings at his house in Salas. He was later indicted on the RICO case in the early 1980s. Crow and others were given orders by NF Lieutenant Tibon Lozoya via First Captain Death Row Joe to take out NF co-founder Chalo Hernandez down in Bakersfield in 1977. Crow ended up testifying against the NF in that case and DO'd like many NF did during the late 1970s to early 80s. Lawrence Perico Saldivar was a hitman for NF Captain Arthur Rock Beltran. On April 4th, 1978, Saldivar and Tex Hernandez were found guilty in the jail killing of inmate Steven Reveles of Oxnard, California. Reveles was on the NF hit list for not following directives. He was strangled and stabbed in the county jail. Perico also DO'd after the 1982 NF RICO, as many did, and was housed at Old Folsom 4A in the early 1980s and housed for many years at Mule Creek State Prison, which was known as a PC yard.
Philip Gato Lopez was another NF member from Salas, indicted on the 1982 RICO case, and his current status is unknown to me. John Buzzard Castro was an NF from the 1970s, as was Danny Cobb, who I recall as being an uncle of the famous Gabriel brothers from Salas. Hank Diamond Cortez was an NF in the 1970s and 80s, who was also said to have traveled to Washington State. I show he was housed in Pelican Bay in 2000 on an H number.
Cortez was beat down and slashed in the Monterey County Jail in 2001 and finally dropped out. Cortez operated with Frank Pilo Miranda, who was housed with many NF in DVI's L Wing in the late 1970s. He was also part of the I-5 Northwest Connection I've talked about many times.
The Din Castro brothers were from Salas, and I mentioned Casper Castro in several of my NF videos. He was an NF captain under Babo Sosa, who also operated as a coyote, smuggling illegals from the Tijuana-San Diego border all the way up and down the West Coast. Black Pete Bang was another NF member who traveled to Washington State. And Fidel Gallo Imperial was yet another NF with connections to Washington State, who was a big drug runner, as was his sister. I'm going to probably have to do a separate Washington, California NF connection video. But there are many interesting individuals that I know of that operated there, even though the California Gang Task Force says that is not true. I actually sat side by side many of these individuals and spoke to them back in the day. I may have mentioned this before, but what happened there is kind of like Hawaii. where I currently reside. A lot of people don't consider Hawaii to be even part of the United States because it's an island way out in the Pacific. Well, the same thing kind of occurred with Washington State. NF and Northern Structure there had some California connections, but often were doing things their own style. In fact, NF General Skip Villanueva scolded them as mixing apples with oranges. And in recent years, many of them there that operated under the Norteno Big Dogs have now fallen underneath control of the NF, and as good soldados are expected to. Art Tibon Lozoya was an NF captain under Babo Sosa. He was said to have been killed by a current NF General, Corny Tristan, in 1981 at DVI.
David Flaco Lozoya operated in the Gilas and Sanjo, as well as Salas areas, where he committed murders in the late 1970s and was given a term of life without parole. He died in Corcoran Chu, natural causes, in 2014, being a true NF soldado to the very end.
David Termite Mendoza was an NF captain in the 1970s at DVI. I think he was related to Danny Dangerous D. Mendoza, who was killed in July 1991 in the Monterey courthouse after he went after a court security officer's gun. Ruben Flaco Mama Box was an NF member I had at New Folsom in the late 1980s and was known as being a dope fiend.
Flaco, like other former NF, often hung around David Bandit Wicked Rios, who was also in my yard and was a former hitman from San Juan. His brother, Robert the Easter Bunny Rios, was housed at Old Folsom in the mid-1980s and was still active in the O around that time.
Miguel M.C. Castillo was a well-respected NF captain and was a member since the 1970s, who was killed by the NF in 1998. I know of quite a few NF who left the organization after that hit by Rico Smiley Garcia and Cesar Lobo Ramirez.
Copas was furious at them for killing his longtime homeboy and carnal, MC.
Lobo dioed after a Copas Gallegos sympathizer tried to take him out when Copas was fighting with other NF over the Salas Regiment. As far as I know, Smiley Garcia is still in good standings in the feds, even though he was warned by other Cs about his gambling addiction problems. Maureen Terrible T. Tex Hernandez is a longtime NF member who has been discussed in several previous videos. Like Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba, he's been a controversial figure in the O.
Art Smiley Ramirez was a longtime figure in the NF and had serious dope connections via his father. He ran operations out of the King's Den in Salas, but fell out of favor when he got into a serious dispute with Pablo Pantera Peña de San Juan. Smiley had declared himself to be the boss of all bosses, the sole general, like Babo Sosa was at one time. Besides beefing with Pantera, Smiley also got into it with Corny Tristan, insisted that the NF Constitution read that there was to be 3 generals in the overall governing body, formerly called La Mesa. Corny won out, and both Smiley and Pantera were ejected from the O. Smiley currently resides at San Quentin Prison and is 70 years old. Rene Chispas Ortiz is a former NF captain who was sponsored in the O by Brown Bob Viramontes and Smiley Ramirez. His debrief is very damaging. He was last housed at Pleasant Valley State Prison, but is either no longer in CD custody or is deceased. Armando Suave Heredia Santa Cruz was made a carnal by Hector Corpus Gallegos, then made a regimental commander by Lizard Hernandez, as cited in Operation Black Widow. He rolled after being indicted in that case. Eddie Boy Joker Perales was a young and hungry NF at DVI in the early 1980s and was named in the 1990s RICO case. He did not stab Babo Sosa, as some have alleged, but he may have tried to get to him. Perhaps that's where the rumor came from. It was later found out that Joker stole money from the NF bank, so he rolled and is presently housed at Mule Creek State Prison.
I have notes of Robert Chico Rose being with the Salinas Regiment as well as the San Juan Regiment. But I know that sometimes people are reassigned from one regiment to another. Chico was sponsored into the organization by Tex Hernandez and held the keys in the late 1990s at San Quentin. Chico was a big meth dealer known for being very paranoid, so probably was using too much of his own product, and was a key figure in Operation Black Widow and soon became a dropout.
Raymond Sanchez was a former NF associate and rogue drug dealer who was killed by a Northern Instruction member named Armando Frias at Cap Saloon in Salinas in the Chinatown area of that city in 2011. Frias was later arrested in Oklahoma City. Sitting next to Sanchez was Joseph Criminal Cantu, who had ties to Oregon and Arizona. There is still some controversy over this murder that involved NF shot caller Lizard Hernandez, who was a federal informant at the time. And more details on this case are mentioned in my book. Peter Sparky Alviar was an NF associate and drug dealer in the 1980s and 1990s who ran with the Frias family. He dropped out around the year 2000. Jeremy Chino Lord is from Salas and did time at Pelican Bay and Corcoran Shoes, and in recent years was housed at Salinas Valley State Prison.
Albert Berglares is from Salas East Side Market Barrio, which is probably the most well-known hood in the city. He is mentioned in several NF cases ordering murders,
such as that of drug dealer Martin Kung Fu Chacon in 2012. There was Andrew Demon Ramirez, who was well documented at Corcoran Shoe as being only associate, although I think he may have been an undercover member. Charlie Brown Akala was only listed in CDC as being an NF associate in the feds, but I'd say that was a very close associate, if not a member. He was very close to NF Armando Bandit Valles, as well as Copas Gallegos, and sent to the feds.
And more recently, Dwayne Dizzy Jefferson was prosecuted as being an NF member from Salas, who was housed at Pleasant Valley State Prison. Donald Duck Moran was an NF state captain who may have some problems in the feds, as well as other state NF, as I mentioned in previous episodes. Duck authorized the hit on longtime Salinas Regiment member Matt Maton Rocha in the California Department of Corrections. Matt was loyal to the federal faction and has many family connections to the NF. Ernest Powder Killinger was an NF mentioned during Operation Black Widow and is currently housed at the ADX in Florence, Colorado. Robert Patrick Bubba Hannaran was a major NF drug dealer who was eventually made a Salas regimental commander. He is currently housed in the federal BOP with fellow NF Martin Cyclone Montoya at the Pollock facility. The city of Soledad is also known as Chole, which refers to the prison there as well as the town. One of the earliest NF from Chole was Gus Rivera, who joined in the late 1960s. Aurelio Conejo Garcia was an NF documented from there in the 1980s. I have Israel Shorty-Kota as being from there, but also from Greenpass, which is the town of Greenfield. I believe that Daniel Stork Perez actually came out of Chole, but is usually associated with Salinas in the Salas Regiment. I also understand that Stork's dad was an early Texas Syndicate member in Calipas. I bumped into his sister one time at one of my corrections classes, which was quite shocking to me, although she was very polite. Stork was a key figure in the NF and was a captain during the 1990s. He beefed with Bad Boy Bernias from San Juan, who was one of the key players in the Brown Bob Villamontes homicide. Stork was prosecuted during Operation Black Widow and did time in the feds as well as the state. When he was in the feds, he was stabbed by Aryan Brotherhood member Lonnie Taylor in July 2010 at the Atlanta pen. He was released from the BOP in 2018 and I understand was severely beaten in 2020 and put into a coma. Leonard Sparky Garza is from Greenfuss and was arrested in 2010, I believe for a firearms charge. Mark Molo Pajas is also from Greenfuss, and his son operated in Washington State as an Norteno Barrio, Spokane, Washington area. Guillermo Sleepy Capon Solario ran with the NF in the late 1990s and was sent to the Bay. He was named in a recent RICO case in 2021. Miguel Mike Rico had ties to the small town of Gonzales and ran as a young NF member in the late 1960s at DBI and was active throughout the 1970s. Watsonville is the largest city in Santa Cruz County and has very close ties to the Salinas Regiment, which is why I chose to talk about them in this segment. Larry Paco Amaro was very active in NF politics in recent years. He is from the East Las Casitas Varrios and was finally sent to the feds, where he is housed with other NF brass, as seen in this picture. Juan Huayno Gallegos was another very active NF member in recent years and was sent to the BOP. Javier Pelon Martinez was active at San Quentin, the Bay, and Tehachapi Shoe, and was known as a very good artist, but Aisho is no longer in custody. Sergio Spoquillo Alvarez was an NF member with a K number, housed at Pelican Bay over the last couple of decades. Ruben Lobo Rentana Martinez was an NF member during the 1970s and ran drugs for the organization from Mexico in the 1980s, but was later ordered killed by Copas Gallegos since he was competition for Copas. So he dealed. Jose Cheeks Maldonado was also from the area and active in the 1970s through 80s. Angel Chango Alvarez was an NF member who was stabbed to death out on the streets in 1997, shortly after his release from prison. Angel Güero Campa was an NF member who was active around 1990. Eddie Little Loco Campos was an NF who was housed in the SHU at Pelican Bay during the 2000s. Antonio Tigre Rubalcaba was from Watson, I believe from Barrio Green Valley. Rubalcaba was associated with the NF under Captain Boxer Mendoza and operated as an enforcer for Baby Joker Cabrera.
Albert Doughboy Martinez was also from Watson, as indicated by the W tattooed on his throat.
Martinez was a former NF arrested in May 2011. As I recall, he was celled at one Oscar Baby Joker Cabrera Amezcua, who was a key local shot caller, but dropped out during the state-federal split. BJ was loyal to the federal while he was housed in CDC, and most recently was housed in Corcoran.
Another individual in NF politics was Gilbert Bumper Jack Guzman, also from Watson,
who was arrested on a major case in 2011. Tommy Chapo McIntosh is half black and Mexican and has prominent NF tats. He has been seen pictured with many NF in past years, and you can find more information on Chapo and many other NF mentioned this episode in my book, available on Amazon.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode and return to view many more. Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, cops, and politicians.